Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. 8 people have been arrested by a Turkish court in the western town of Soma on a provisional charge of causing multiple deaths in last week's mine disaster. It comes as the last of the 301 victims were buried. Those arrested included the general manager and the chief executive of the Soma coal mining company. The disaster was the deadliest mining incident in Turkey's history. It also sparked protests across the country, both directed at mine owners, accused of ignoring safety for profit, as well as targeted at the Prime Minister, Tayyip Erdogan's government, seen as too close to industry bosses and insensitive in its response. Indeed, an advisor of Mr. Erdogan sparked outrage after being photographed while kicking a mourner. The Soma accident will focus new attention on Turkey's coal mining safety record. But Mr. Erdogan does enjoy considerable popularity in Turkey, and his country has had eye-watering economic growth. Mr. Erdogan himself managed to shrug off allegations of corruption, and his ruling AKP party did well in this year's municipal elections. But Turkey's track record in mining is not a good one, and Mr. Erdogan has also faced accusations by opponents of clamping down on freedoms, such as the use of Twitter. At a time of Arab Spring unrest, Turkey is often seen by many as a model country for its ability to balance its position as a majority Muslim country with being a secular, democratic society. But how true is this? Mr. Erdogan has been under fire, but what are the political implications for this latest mining disaster? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio here in London by Fadi Hakura. He's manager of the Turkey programme at Chatham House. Also here in London is Dr. Mehmet Asute. He's a reader in Middle Eastern political economy at Durham University. And also here is Aicha Çubukçu, who's the programme director at the Centre for the Study of Human Rights, London School of Economics. Also on the line, we're joined by Dr. Can Aremtan, who's a historian and journalist based in Istanbul. Fadi, I'll start with you. The protests that we saw certainly made headlines around the world. How much of this is directed at the government of Turkey, and how much is it directed at the mine owners themselves?
I think that the protests we saw initially was out of anger. Some of it was directed at the Prime Minister and the government for what was seen as lax application of health and safety rules, and also at the mine owners, especially in the context of the privatization of the mines that Prime Minister Erdogan carried out in 2005. One should not exaggerate the political impacts of these protests. I think that they will have limited impacts on undermining Prime Minister Erdogan's popularity going forward.
Just how popular is he, Mehmet?
Prime Minister currently is enjoying his popularity as it is. The Soma incidents, I do not think that it will have long-term impacts on his popularity. Somehow his popularity is not necessarily can be explained by the localized events in the country. We have to look at the long-term popularity over the last 10-12 years. He has achieved very well, and he still enjoys huge support in the larger Anatolia and the main cities. And therefore, I do not think that this current incident, as we have seen 17th December incidents, which were more crashing perhaps for government, they managed very well and survived out of it. So therefore, considering the political economy of the country, I do not think that Soma will be a huge impact or adverse impact on his popularity.
Aicha, that's quite unusual, I suppose, to Western audiences, because when we see one of his advisors attacking somebody, one of the mourners, and also the Prime Minister himself getting involved in some kind of fisticuff, some kind of altercation with somebody, that would be enough to finish most Western European politicians, but not him.
No, not at all. Actually, that's part of the surreality of what we're seeing, I would say, because although there have been popular reactions against the Prime Minister for allegations of slapping somebody in a supermarket he had to escape into, and we have Yusuf Yarkel caught on camera kicking a mourner, there has been no talk of resignation from the government. In other places that may have caused a resignation, but not in Turkey.
So, John, the outcry was more of an international one than a domestic one, because the outcry certainly here in the United Kingdom was, this is completely outrageous.
Well, in Turkey, the reaction was quite, impressive as well. In Soma itself, as well as in Istanbul, as well as in Ankara and in Izmir. Due to the fact that the government has a very strict control over the media, news of these events did not really reach many people in Turkey. And if the Tayyip Erdogan's core constituency became aware of these protests, they were shrugged off as crazies and marginal people who normally are expected to oppose Tayyip Erdogan and the AKP government. In Turkey as well, there was a very strong reaction against these events directed at the government and directed at the private owners. But due to very nicely executed government censorship, word didn't really get out. And then at the same time, we have to admit that even though these protests were quite large, the actual core constituency of Tayyip Erdogan is much, much bigger.
So, John, you're saying that the outcry internationally over that particular incident, I'm not talking about the mine in particular, but I'm talking about the advisor attacking, or at least seen to be attacking a mourner, plus Mr. Erdogan himself allegedly slapping somebody. That wasn't necessarily reported by local media. That was international media, or at least social media, perhaps, getting that out.
It was primarily social media getting it out, as well as opposition newspapers. State-controlled media did not report these events.
The idea of the social media aspect of this, Fadi, do you see this as some kind of social media uprising?
We should not exaggerate the influence of social media in Turkey. Only 1/3 of Turks have access to broadband internet. 15% of Turks only use Twitter. Most of the Turks who use Twitter tend to be globally connected, educated. The typical Erdogan supporter, who tends to be a religious conservative, probably does not access Twitter. At the same time, also, the average Erdogan supporter tends to have an excessive respect for authority, is a utilitarian voter, so cares mostly about their pocket, the economy, bread and butter issues, rather than about civil liberties or corruption or mining accidents. Really looks up to Prime Minister Erdogan as one of them, and really likes his strong, tough, muscular, confrontational approach to politics.
So it's very successful, Aide. I mean, the economy has been growing hand over fist over the last 10 years. Do you think Turks are happy with that pace of change and with that economic growth?
I think the incident in Soma actually reveals the dark side of that economic growth. It has opened up a conversation about development and the cost of economic growth, as well as labor conditions, which are against worker safety, basically. So I see this as a possibility, in fact, to open up a larger conversation about development as such.
Mehmet, do you see it that way, that the economic growth is due to cost-cutting, and is this mine tragedy an example of
yes,
that level of
certainly,
cost-cutting?
that's inevitable. We are talking about neoliberal policies, not today, but since 1980s, not only in Turkey, but quite large number of developing countries. They all suffer, and they are suffering the same consequences, unfortunately. But there is another aspect of economic growth in Turkey, not development, but economic growth in Turkey. You have to consider the smaller SMEs, smaller size of manufacturing units in the larger Anatolia contributing to economic growth. The value-added contribution of the large companies as compared to the SMEs, that's an important issue for us to look into. In terms of exploitation, the exploitation level in large corporations, regardless whether they are AKP-oriented companies or not, there's a social culture here, regardless of AKP. I mean, all those people, some celebrities and etc., they have been going Soma. Do you think when they were spending hundreds of Turkish lira in Nişantaşı cafes, they have ever thought that there's a social implication of this guy, the person who is working in that cafeteria, how much gets as a salary, which is the minimum wage, less than 250 pounds. So therefore, the social culture aspect of it, regardless whether Islamically oriented, secular or not, there is a general problem in the country.
John, going back to the mine tragedy, this is specifically about cost cutting.
The company which is operating the mine in Soma, Soma Holding AŞ, is the company which provides the AKP, the ruling party, with free bags of coal which are distributed prior to every election, thereby securing voters that they will indeed vote for Tayyip Erdogan and his cohorts. To get hold of these free bags of coal, costs need to be cut. And as such, the Soma Holding Company actually succeeded in really significantly driving down the costs of coal, down from $130 to $140 a kilo to 23.80. Indeed, this is the outcome of neoliberal policies of extreme privatization. Extreme privatization is actually at the basis of Turkey's economic miracle that we are still experiencing. And it might very well turn out to be a bubble that's about to burst.
Privatization, Fadi, but privatization that seems to have really worked and increased money in the pockets of the average Turkish person?
I think that it's not the issue of privatization, but the type of privatization the government undertook. It was a revenue maximizing privatization rather than trying to promote competition in the private sector. Also, the other thing is that Turkey's economic boom now is well and truly over. Turkey's economic was an artificial boom driven by a credit-fueled consumption. It was financed by dollar-denominated debt. Now that's pretty much come to an end. Turkey now has entered a prolonged period of economic stagnation. We're talking average growth rates going in the next 5 to 10 years at least of around 3%, 2 to 3%, which is quite slow for Turkey at its current stage of economic development. And that in part explains why Prime Minister Erdogan's popularity has now begun to decline, albeit at a gradual pace.
Although 2 to 3%, I think neighbouring countries would be eyeing that jealously,
yes,
namely Greece, Cyprus. They'll be looking at 2 to 3% and saying, well, gosh, we'd like some of that.
I think that would be terribly oversimplistic of Turkish economy. You have to consider that in 1980, when Turkey adopted neoliberal policies, the export of Turkey was $1.8 billion. And today Turkey not exporting only primary goods but manufactured goods. And that is over $100 billion. So there is a huge infrastructure. It is which sustains the economic growth. Of course, the current government's policies, unfortunately, on the real estate sector will have some consequences, but we have to consider the increased manufacturing and the production base of Turkish economy, which is very well reflected with the kind of goods Turkey exports.
If you look at actually composition of Turkey's export profile, actually it's not very encouraging. Over 10 years ago, 5% of Turkey's exports were in the high-tech sector. Today it's less than 2%. These are World Bank statistics. Also, if you look at the raw numbers of export figures in Turkey, they look impressive. But you have to look at them as a percentage of gross domestic product. And there it's been stagnant. It was 23.6% of around a quarter of the economy in 2003. Now it's still a quarter of the economy today. So export growth has simply kept pace with economic growth.
That doesn't undermine the existing manufacturing base of the country and the production economy.
What we saw in Soma was a situation of subcontracting by the state. So the mine still belongs to the state, but a private company, the Soma Corporation, was contracted as a subcontractor to extract the coal. And in that sense, we must raise the question of responsibility. This mine, although operated by a private corporation, still is under the purview of the state. There is legal ground as well for claiming that the government, the state as such, is responsible for what we saw there.
John, little that people can do to oppose the state. I mean, if these protests are dying out and don't reflect the will of the majority of Mr. Erdogan's supporters, then where do we go from here?
But over the past 5 days, the government has taken about three U-turns. Mm-hmm. The first reaction, as expressed by Tayyip Erdogan himself, was, it happens, it's fate. The second reaction by the government was, the owner is at fault. In other words, Soma holding Ashi. The third U-turn is that some members of the government, particularly Faruk Çelik, the employment minister, is calling for people to take up political responsibility. And in this respect, the employment minister has said that it's got nothing to do with him. And he is then throwing the ball towards the Minister for Energy and Natural Resources, Taner Yildiz, calling for Taner Yıldız's resignation. It's not really all that simple.
But it does suggest, Fadi, that Mr. Erdogan is perhaps, in his own funny way, admitting some kind of guilt, but he's trying to find a way out of this crisis. If he's saying that, and in fact, he invoked the mine disasters of the 19th century, Victorian England and stuff, which came across as quite strange to people here. He is trying to find a way out of this crisis in some kind of way.
He's not admitting guilt as much as trying to lay blame on other people. Whenever Prime Minister Erdogan is in a corner, he is very decisive and ruthless and will take whatever necessary action to survive in politics. We saw that, for example, in the corruption allegations that erupted 17th December last year. He fired 4 ministers from the government.
I'd like to get your point on this. I mean, that those corruption allegations, well, there are more than allegations. There seem to be quite considerable evidence, visual at least, and they stemmed back to December. Does this make Mr. Erdogan a kind of Teflon prime minister? Nothing really seems to stick to him.
Part of the reason why nothing seems to stick is because of the discourse of conspiracy that we have in the country. So the corruption scandal as well, even the disaster in Soma, were framed by many supporters of Erdogan as a conspiracy to get him out of power. And we cannot underestimate the power of this thinking, all the conspiratorial logic that is operating in the public domain in Turkey at the moment. That seems to explain everything. So there was a discourse of sabotage planned specifically to get him out of power, as well as the scandal over the false attack on Syria and the corruption scandal.
Now, the false attack on Syria you're talking about was when he was accused of shooting down a Syrian fighter, and that was an idea that, well, it was seen as a ploy to rally voters ahead of these municipal elections. Now, it didn't seem to have any impact in the municipal elections which was seen as a referendum on his popularity, Mehmet.
I guess the cases against the AKP government was very hard. The issue was that beyond the conspiracy of issues, the people who have been creating this environment, mainly the Gulen group, is as corrupt as the government. Therefore, unfortunately, it didn't have the impact. The hard evidence there, but the people who put forward the Gulen group is as corrupt as the government itself. Therefore, it didn't have impact. And the AKP and the Prime Minister's management of that issue, and they sold it very well to the general public that, there's a conspiracy, these guys are after us, and these guys, although they were with us, but at the same time, you have to understand the political economy of Turkey. And that is perhaps a bit of difficulty when I read coming commentaries. Still looking at the Turkish society from outside, from the top, you have to go to the periphery to see what is happening in the periphery. Therefore, people's expectation that there is a stability here, that stability, as you mentioned earlier, economic growth and etc., it is better that we go with these guys. The whole idea of the myopic voters and etc., all those working together, creating entirely another dynamic, and just the corruption has been an important culture of Turkish politics. Unfortunately, this is not new.
So, John, it's a matter of spin. His spin doctors are doing a very effective job, it sounds like.
It's a very clever exercise in spin doctoring. Prior to the elections, the government issued a booklet in which it explained the links between the graft probe of December and the Gezi protests of the previous summer. And what the government put forward was that the people behind these attacks on the government were a US-based think tank sponsored by the Israeli government. That was actually material that was published by the government prior to the elections as a kind of manifesto. The government is also fanning the flames of conspiracy theories, and they're being quite successful at that because the core constituency of Erdogan and the AKP are people whose sole source of information is the TV. And on TV, all they can hear is government propaganda. And then when they get this government propaganda in the form of booklets and other leaflets, which were distributed prior to the elections, confirming what they hear on the news, they know what to do, which is to vote for Erdogan and his cohorts. If you look at the local elections, it is true that Erdogan's party won about 40 to 45%, but that also means that 50 to 60% of Turkish population did not vote for the AKP. Maybe we should not see the outcome of these local elections as such a clear-cut AKP victory.
You seem to be saying, all of you, is that domestically this is having little impact. These protests are having little impact on his power, at least. As a member of NATO, surrounded by some regional conflicts, Turkey is seen as an island of stability, like it or lump it. What does the West do?
There's nothing that the West really can do in the absence of a credible European Union accession process, which really does not exist except in name. United States doesn't really care that much as long as Turkey fulfills its security responsibility, which it is doing. And you can see also relations between Turkey and Russia are very, very good, despite disagreements over Syria and Ukraine. Overall, when it comes to, there's not really much the international community can do, except in the economic pressure, applying economic pressure on Turkey. but that's very, very unlikely in the near term.
There's a sense in which the Turkish state and the Turkish government are failing in their security responsibility. When you see images of the state attacking protesters so ruthlessly, killing them, wounding them, maiming them, there's a sense in which that responsibility to protect its own population, which is held by the Turkish government, is not being fulfilled. On the contrary. And I see a danger here because part of the success of Erdogan has been the ability to mobilize a discourse of national will. He constantly presents himself as if there was an undivided national will and he was the sole representative of it. So whomever whomever opposes his rule gets posited as a terrorist, as a provocateur, as a traitor. So this is a very dangerous discourse that positions the opposition in a very difficult situation, although it is not accepted by the people who are opposing the government. Still, the mobilization of the security discourse is very, very dangerous.
But world leaders who do that tend to appeal to patriotism and nationalism. Yes. A sense, in this case, of Turkishness. Is he doing that?
He is doing that. And actually, one can draw a comparison between Sisi in Egypt and Erdogan in Turkey. It's an almost identical discourse that the two are mobilizing. Although Erdogan is blaming the government of Sisi in Egypt for executing the Muslim Brotherhood, for opposing the movement called the Muslim Brotherhood, he is mobilizing an almost identical discourse vis-a-vis the opposition in Turkey.
John, Peace and Democracy Party members have been imprisoned on account of activism. These include mayors, students, intellectuals and so on. What do you think will be the fate of those protesters over the last few weeks?
I imagine that there could very well be waves of arrests, but maybe not, because it is a very tricky situation at the moment. Because many people have died. Official accounts state that 301 miners have perished. But at the same time, there are rumors that in a mine shaft which has as yet not been accessed, 400 to 450 more miners are trapped and presumed dead. It has been put forward by the journalist Ali Tezel, who normally writes on issues relating to social welfare and social security, in that as yet untouched mine shaft. The miners trapped in there are actually Syrian refugees and children who have been employed by Soma Holding to do the same job as the Turkish miners, but for a fraction of the cost. And that for that reason, the government is keeping a lid on this side of the story, which is that the Soma Holding private enterprise is also supporting Erdogan's Syria policy, which is also part of his internal policy of Sunnification. By that I mean that Tayyip Erdogan seems to be at work to transform the Republic of Turkey from a Turkish nation state into a Muslim federation of Anatolia, inhabited by various ethnicities, all proclaiming to be Muslim.
Interesting. I'd like to get your response to that, Mehmet.
I think I have always supported the idea of the federation in Turkey. It's a very large country, but at the same time, different ethnicities, the Kurds have suffered immensely. And considering all those realities, I always supported. But rather than being a Muslim federative state, you have to consider that I have to appreciate that currently government's position in relation to Armenians, as well as the return of the foundation, the wealth of the foundations, the Christian foundations, including Armenian foundations, return to them. These are important steps, and therefore I think we should not shift the discourse suggesting that an Islamic new development is happening in Turkey. It is true that Erdogan and his team religiously oriented people, but in terms of political economy of AKP, I hardly see any Islam in that political economy. I think that would be another shift in the process, which I think will be terribly unnecessary in terms of understanding the current developments as well as the developments that have been taking place in the country. The reality is that Erdogan and AKP is still, for me, a nationally oriented government, and that's the reality of it. And however, the current reality is, as well as looking at most of the European countries, how the federal systems are working, I think that will be, if they can achieve that, they will have my support for that. That will be a fantastic way out for Turkey to ease its political burden, and in particular responding to the Kurds and other ethnic groups.
John, do you want to respond to that?
Well, yes, I'm afraid that I will have to disagree vehemently, because I do not see the AKP as a nationalist party. They are an Islamic party. They are trying to redefine Turkish nationalism in terms of the typical Turkish interpretation of Islam, which does not mean that they are not Muslim. Obviously, they're Muslim, but they are Turkish Muslims. In other words, they have their own particular brand of Islam.
Just for the benefit of our listeners, so we're talking about a kind of interpretation of Islam that blends traditional values with modernity. Would that be a fair description?
Well, yes.
Okay, and the promotion of the religious network of Hizmet, perhaps, would be...
No, that has been the major problem in this 17th December process.
I personally think that Turkey might very well be on the way of becoming a second Pakistan in Western Asia.
Okay, well, look, we've certainly got disagreement there, but just to finish up, what if there are convictions, Fadi? What do you think will happen? Will that satisfy those who have been calling for them, convictions of the mine owners, I mean?
I think nothing will change. I think the mining accidents will continue, the workplace accidents will continue. Turkey's abysmal record on workplace accidents, 880,000 workplace accidents over the last 10 years under this government.
But it's an acceptance that some heads have to roll.
There will be some heads rolling, but at the end of the day, I think nothing will really change. The economic system will continue as is, and the political system will continue as is.
Yes.
So the international community will be keen to keep Turkey on side, I guess, and Erdogan has their ear.
Yes, the international community will, but the protest movement we've been seeing in Turkey will also keep an eye on the government, obviously. Actually, I don't see the story as a closed book. We still don't know what could happen, because the crisis of legitimacy that was experienced by the Erdogan government was only deepened by the incident in Soma. There are many people who do not believe the official figures, 301 miners dead. We know the mine has been sealed up, as John had suggested. Many people are suspicious that an independent investigation is being prevented at the moment. So the situation still remains unpredictable, and one effect has been the opening up of the economy, of neoliberal development as a problematic aspect of the Erdogan government. And we do not know how those discussions will go. We may see new kinds of mobilizations. We may see new alliances that are being built within the working class. We may see, we still don't know what may come after.
With the Gezi moments as well as the recent protests, I think it shows that a strong civil society is coming out. Because in the past, the majority of these people who are in the protests, either they would walk to the mausoleum of Atatürk or they would have called the generals. And now they are there out there themselves. Yes. That's a huge positive sign in terms of development of civil society in Turkey.
After all, Turkey has a very young population, and these are all accessing the internet. And so they're all basically flash mobs doing political action.
So by the time the centennial of the foundation of modern Turkey takes place, do you see civil society being strong, Mehmet?
Yes, I see that it is coming stronger. And we have seen that religiously oriented civil society organizations have been coming out strongly as well in different issues. So there is a development, but most importantly, I think the secular segment of the protest. In the past, they would have called, we are the soldiers of Mustafa Kemal and etc. on the streets, but now no. They are out there as part of civil society rather than finding refuge in the militarism of the Kemalism.
Fascinating stuff. Well, that's all we've got time for. Sadly, we've run out of time, but many thanks. That's Dr. Mehmet Asutay, who is a reader in Middle Eastern political economy at Durham University. Also joining me here in London, Dr. H. Chubukchu, who's the program director at the Centre for the Study of Human Rights at LSE, and also here Fadi Hakura, manager of the Turkey programme at Chatham House. That's the think tank based here in London. On the line from Istanbul, Dr. Can Eramtan, who's a historian and journalist in Istanbul. Thank you very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London. It's quite unusual, I suppose, to Western audiences, because when we see one of his advisors attacking somebody, one of the mourners, and also the Prime Minister himself getting involved in some kind of fisticuff, some kind of altercation with somebody, that would be enough to finish most Western European politicians, but not him.
No, not at all. Actually, that's part of the surreality of what we're seeing, I would say, because although there have been popular reactions against the Prime Minister for allegations of slapping somebody in a supermarket he had to escape into, and we have Yusuf Yarkel caught on camera kicking a mourner, there has been no talk of resignation from the government. In other places that may have caused a resignation, but not in Turkey.
So, John, the outcry was more of an international one than a domestic one, because the outcry certainly here in the United Kingdom was, this is completely outrageous. Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. 8 people have been arrested by a Turkish court in the western town of Soma on a provisional charge of causing multiple deaths in last week's mine disaster. It comes as the last of the 301 victims were buried. Those arrested included the general manager and the chief executive of the Soma coal mining company. The disaster was the deadliest mining incident in Turkey's history. It also sparked protests across the country, both directed at mine owners, accused of ignoring safety for profit, as well as targeted at the Prime Minister, Tayyip Erdogan's government, seen as too close to industry bosses and insensitive in its response. Indeed, an advisor of Mr. Erdogan sparked outrage after being photographed while kicking a mourner. The Soma accident will focus new attention on Turkey's coal mining safety record. But Mr. Erdogan does enjoy considerable popularity in Turkey, and his country has had eye-watering economic growth. Mr. Erdogan himself managed to shrug off allegations of corruption, and his ruling AKP party did well in this year's municipal elections. But Turkey's track record in mining is not a good one, and Mr. Erdogan has also faced accusations by opponents of clamping down on freedoms, such as the use of Twitter. At a time of Arab Spring unrest, Turkey is often seen by many as a model country for its ability to balance its position as a majority Muslim country with being a secular, democratic society. But how true is this? Mr. Erdogan has been under fire, but what are the political implications for this latest mining disaster? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio here in London by Fadi Hakura. He's manager of the Turkey programme at Chatham House. Also here in London is Dr. Mehmet Asute. He's a reader in Middle Eastern political economy at Durham University. And also here,
Prime Minister currently is enjoying his popularity as it is. The Soma incidents, I do not think that it will have long-term impacts on his popularity. Somehow his popularity is not necessarily can be explained by the localized events in the country. We have to look at the long-term popularity over the last 10-12 years. He has achieved very well, and he still enjoys huge support in the larger Anatolia and the main cities. And therefore, I do not think that this current incident, as we have seen 17th December incidents, which were more crashing perhaps for government, they managed very well and survived out of it. So therefore, considering the political economy of the country, I do not think that Soma will be a huge impact or adverse impact on his popularity.
That is Aicha Chubukchu, who's the programme director at the Centre for the Study of Human Rights, London School of Economics. Also on the line, we're joined by Dr. Can Eramtan, who's a historian and journalist based in Istanbul. Fadi, I'll start with you. The protests that we saw certainly made headlines around the world. How much of this is directed at the government of Turkey, and how much is it directed at the mine owners themselves?
I think that the protests we saw initially was out of anger. Some was directed at the Prime Minister and the government for what was seen as lax application of health and safety rules, and also at the mine owners, especially in the context of the privatization of the mines that Prime Minister Erdogan carried out in 2005. One should not exaggerate the political impacts of these protests. I think that they will have limited impacts on undermining Prime Minister Erdogan's popularity going forward.
Just how popular is he?